Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Japanese warfare. It's really the first time I ever talk about Japanese history, or better that I dedicate an entire video to it, being part of the Enemies of China series, because, I talk about mostly ancient medieval Chinese warfare and of all these other peoples surrounding Imperial China, that, as we've seen, overlaps also with our Western focus, in fact, in Western Eurasia. And that will include at some point an overview about Japanese warfare in the Middle Ages as a whole, or also in part a bit of ancient history as well. This is a mini-series I will probably make in 3 episodes about an eventmental quasi-fairy tale-like history of medieval Japanese warfare for different reasons. It's part of the broader specials, so we'll not even come back on it too soon again, but it's going to be in the air this year. And I thought it being quite relevant, given that, first of all, we had never talked about medieval Japanese warfare. Second, I must admit that I've never, in spite of sort of the nerdy aura that is normally attached to people fascinated with medieval warfare, whatever, studied this period. I never had any particular interest in it. Of course, I've read about it. I have some information. In fact, I will put together here to provide sort of a satisfactory browsing of the theme. But you have the advantage of actually getting this Japanese warfare from a lens, from an angle that is truly comparative, neutral, so not coming from any specific obsession or passion or interest in it, which I think is sometimes difficult to find. I've never really checked out also medieval Japanese warfare content on YouTube. I don't know how and what there is out there. I presume that besides, summarizing katanas, etc., there isn't really much of a strong eventmental history, especially as far as the earlier medieval period is concerned. But I may be easily wrong, because again, there is, as you know, a niche especially emerging, I suspect, in the United States after World War II, with military presence in East Asia, in the Pacific, that brought some kind of obsession. I know that many of you, I see you from Twitter, are obsessed with anime, with all kind of, let's say, also Japanese aesthetics. I've never been into that, ever, right? So I analyze this from a strictly cynical, political and military perspective. And of course, I'm interested in it, because I've also had, if anything, even when I don't know something, I either have a positive or negative bias of the same. Actually, I've always had a slightly, say, in a rational sense, I don't think too highly of anything that is outside of the West. You know that Japan sometimes is included in the West. Sometimes, Brazil is not, but Japan is, for some odd reason. And I don't consider, of course, Japan Western, unless we're talking about very specific things in the last couple of last generations in general, which I would agree to an extent. But I still was sort of emotionally, I can say, subjectively interested in Japanese history, and I would really like to know it fairly well. I studied some of it actually at university. I'll be fair about this, but it was mostly a contemporary history class. The exam was verted basically on, it was, I think, history of, I don't remember what it actually was, but the professor was more about, Japanese cinema, essentially, but also propaganda, during fascism, during World War II. In fact, the exam was mostly about that, but the books that we had to study, being about Japanese history in general, did start from the beginning, of also Japanese religion, tradition, etc. And we'll get more into that in some history of religion video. So I thought of this starting with the first chapter on the period going roughly from 600 to 1100 AD. Then the last episode of the tree will actually be more about sort of the most famous Renaissance warfare period in Japan that we tend to sort of more know about. In fact, I am planning, well, in the wake of this, yet another miniseries focusing specifically on it, which would be, in fact, helpful and would, in fact, provide us with also a consistent amount of pertinent content for anyone interested in the broader picture. Today we talk about the earliest period in this timeline. This early high medieval Japanese world that we observe mostly from a military point of view. Today we will not talk more than much about tactics per se, unit types, or the kind of battlefield mechanics. We will discuss this mostly in the general video about medieval Japanese warfare, and we will see also some examples of battles and military units and so on over time, for sure. We will, however, appreciate the political dynamics behind warfare, of course, as an instrument of politics, Clausewitzionly speaking. The Japanese also, as you know, styled their army on the Prussian model later in the 19th century, the Meiji Revolution. Although that's really another story. I want to make a mini-series about Tsushima as well, bear sashimis, like for those who ask me about, more Muscovite adventures, like on YouTube. And that's yet even a more distant story. In any case, this period, as you know, we could also be comparatively analyzed, meaning that especially when we will make the broader video about what was Japanese warfare in general, and the essentials and the fundamentals of medieval history, we will compare more. Today, we see this from the within, mostly through a political history, right? Warfare wasn't radically changing. As you know, Japan was fairly isolated in general, not sealed off. We talked about the Mongol invasions of Japan in our, in fact, videos about the Kingizid, dynasty in China. There something emerged already, but of course we didn't see the Japanese side, and that can be yet another mini-series like the Mongols invasion, ill-fated invasions of Japan. So today we will look at the political history, like monumental events in Japan were unfolding at this point. They must be understood. And we see it from the within, as if this was a fairy tale, a saga, right, of Japanese history. We could make many digressions, such as the ones on Bushido. That is the essence of the warrior, blossoming really in this period, right? The idea of the warrior spirit in these centuries refined in its martial traditions during a time of this epic changes, growing through the actions of the great clans, crafting tales of heroism, tragedy, and cunning, embedding a code of loyalty, honor, and discipline in what was essentially warrior estate, driven by the need to maintain order and identity amidst political chaos and clan rivalries. This was a very perennialistic traditional view. It had to do essentially with the samurai knightly ethos as well. But of course the Japanese source is sort of more customized, and we will see this at some other point. I would also point out, as I do for my medieval, say, European history and warfare content, that there is indeed a traditional background to this, but the romanticization of that is sometimes important because there are some aspects coming from a real elaboration of these cultures that are also somehow more familiar with that was actually part of that. But at large, this is to some extent, to other levels, not really mirroring the actually traditional meaning of this whole. By the way, Japan, as you know, is an incredibly xenophobic culture. They had a history that we decided to romanticize, that there is all the post-World War II mythology of the brave, the honorable, this stuff. Those are all things that came to be mostly within the Western world to some standard that probably not the same Japanese today understand very much. By the way, there are examples in the world that really show you how you can modernize, you can sort of advance, but still culture develops at a very different speed. And so Japanese people at large do not know nor understand anything about European history, for example, but in a much more dramatic sense than the way we could ignore Japanese history. And if you have any prolonged experience with non-Western cultures, people, thoughts, you know that we are radically unique in our own sense of, capacity to really hegemonize the world, so as far as our understanding of these cultures really go. So it's, again, a very interesting topic. This early phase of the Japanese Middle Ages sheds relatively little light on the mechanics of warfare that we would otherwise be searching for in a more typical video. But from a political point of view, it richly illustrates the character of the warriors themselves, right? Look at the establishment, who held power, how and why is necessary to understand, again, how the army worked, who were those people, what ambitions motivated them, and beyond. Now, exploring Japanese military history is thus essentially an examination of individuals, at least we can choose to do so today, with the tensions between this, peculiar political systems and the warrior elite that largely dominated in the aforementioned establishment, and the virtues and shortcomings of those who influenced Japan's path. Now, by the late 7th century, that we can point to as a beginning, given the slow recovery that from the Dark Ages that also Japan, all across Eurasia, had experienced, began to sort of dissipate. Of course, the Dark Ages existed in a documentary sense. They were actually a very temporary moment, as sort of the moment was the greatest contraction. Eventually, medieval civilization began to grow once again. And again, we're talking about the probably farthermost East Asia, in an archipelago, surely very influenced by the Chinese imperial grandeur as well. Many other, we'll see now, religions, movements, cultural phenomena from also more far away in Asia. But it's still really a relatively sheltered system, a fringe one to an extent, yet big enough and, complex enough to produce, in fact, what we mostly are fascinated with when we think about the uniqueness of Japanese culture. So by this period, late 7th century, the Emperor of Japan, that, as you know, descended from God, self-directed in the full wake of universal tradition, had shifted into a largely ceremonial role rather than a hands-on ruler. This had largely happened because powerful noble families, as we will see now, particularly the Fujiwara, maneuvered to control power in the emperor's name, sidelining his direct rule to preserve the symbolic imperial system, while they managed the real governance, reducing his role to a figurehead. Remember what we discussed recently in traditional religion regarding the role of a race of elects in relation to the priesthood, for example, as we'll understand now, had a pretty heavy influence in here, but also and especially the warrior class. Still, Japan held fast to the concept of an imperial system as a whole, by the way. This was the source of legitimization for anyone involved, and as you know, the imperial system continued to this day. Aristocratic families aimed to wield influence under the banner of the imperial house, that was thus conferring an imperium to them. We just mentioned the house Fujiwara as the most dominant clan, not the only one, because, as you know, Japan was fragmented into various clanic provinces that, sort of depending on the circles of fate to an extent, came to power and fell out of it, as we also see today. The Fujiwara had gradually secured the greater control within the emperor's court, mostly through a marrying policy, at least from a formal institutional point of view. Of course, the Fujiwara were very powerful as they were landed owners. They had large estates, military retinues, that kind of power. But, of course, marrying into establishing biological ties with imperial, that is, God's house, is actually pretty important. Ensuring their children themselves took the throne, in filling key court positions like ministers, often forcing ambitious emperors into early retirement as monks. This gave them dominance over the court. This tells you also how feeble the secular imperial power really was. The Fujiwara estates were centered around Nara initially. We will learn now these places. Then shifted towards Kyoto, both key political and cultural hubs, unavoidably. Ministers from the Fujiwara lineage staffed the imperial administration. As we've seen, Fujiwara women married into the emperor's line. By the way, in the 7th century, Japan's religious landscape mixed Shinto, the native worship of kami spirits tied to nature and ancestors, with Buddhism, which spread through imperial endorsement and noble support, influencing art, politics, and society as both coexisted and shaped cultural norms. The warrior class was tendentially more like this is a bit like the investiture controversy and the original sense of the divinity of the Cingulum Militaris. The Shinto represented, of course, the more ancestral and somewhat, in fact, more original, more unspoiled, and definitely Japanese, at least as far as it had developed in this part of Eurasia, way to, in fact, we've seen what this is, the traditional heavenly power, right, through the fuses, the blood, the myth of the blood of the ancestors was perpetuated through the same military warlike practice. Buddhism represented a bit more civilization, but externally enough for a country like Japan to be essentially seen also with some impositive character, given that this the forces of monastic institutions were to heavily interfere with the same imperial policy, bringing about a change, as we will see now, as a sort of reaction to it as well. In 710, Empress Gemnyo designated Nara as the imperial capital, right, to create a permanent centralized seat of power modeled on Chinese cities like Chang'an, aiming to bolster imperial authority, streamline administration, and showcase Japan's growing sophistication through a planned urban center. 75 years later, her descendants moved, however, the capital to Kyoto, abandoning the prior tradition of relocating the capital after each emperor's death to escape the sinister forces tied to that event. And in order to break free from Nara's overpowering Buddhist clergy and political stagnation. Essentially, they picked Kyoto for its defensible position surrounded by mountains and its access to rivers for trade and sustenance. The cultural flourishing around the Nara court sparked one of Japan's most prolific artistic eras. We also have some of these pictures that are also from later centuries, as you can understand, but really impressively, detailed and accurate. If you look at Chinese art, say, during the High Middle Ages, realize that they were dramatically advanced from an artistical point of view. Mostly Japan, as we've seen, was drawing a lot of its its civilizational power concentration, of course, from the Chinese imperial model. This time, the Nara court, let's say, also saw Buddhism growing stronger, which, as we've seen, brings to the eventual unentanglement from it in Kyoto. The imperial government essentially dedicated more than half of its resources to religious projects of some sort. This was an attempt to partially escape the secular clan's control. Nevertheless, it was deemed at some point also overly suffocating. Later historians of Japan point to the opulence and spiritual focus of Nara society as the reason for the eventual weakening of imperial authority itself, so requiring this breaking free. Right? There are similar dynamics here. The first thing that comes into my mind, of course, is not the only one, but from a Western perspective, what had happened to the Visigothic court of Toledo with the local councils, the ingerence there of a Hispano-Visigothic clergy that control, de facto, also the same ruler, which is somewhat similar to what is happening here, except there is less connivance in Japan between, in fact, the secular aristocracy and this Buddhist force. In any case, regardless of the causes for the move to Kyoto, the Nara era and the following Heian period clearly marked the decline of Japan's attempt at a centralized governing structure. The Nara and Heian periods witnessed this fading public authority and centralization capacity because of the excessive spending on the same Buddhist temples, draining resources, noble families like the Fujiwara hoarding power, in a poorly organized conscript army failing to enforce imperial will, empowering regional lords instead. In fact, this is also the point. The Nara period brought both the rise and fall of a national military force. At least there was an attempt to do something similar to military reform. Empress Jito in 689 mandated 1/4, later 1/3 of men serve, aiming to protect the state. This collapsed due to the chaotic organization, reluctant peasant soldiers, and crushing defeats. The idea behind this reform was essentially a last attempt to establish a sort of national force that could support an autonomous imperial government. The recipe for this was not really successful, also considering the times in general. This was, again, one of the moments of greatest contraction. It's true that, say, Japan, as we've seen, worked with a center. There was an imperial court, an imperial house that had, doesn't matter how limited, but still active importance. But this it was just the fruit of also the relatively the isolation of the country, the obvious, let's say, distribution of power in the land was not particularly, again, immense like China, where there would be, in fact, the capacity to maintain some imperial cohesion on much larger territory, but with different forces emerging from the same, and at some point, not entirely shifting the centers of power, but altering them in a proportionate manner. This is the early Middle Ages. The possibility of creating a national army that could basically salvage the emperor, coming from the especially lower strata of the population, to also counterpose itself to nobiliar hegemony, was unfeasible. Creating such an extended levy was just against the same will of the average people that didn't really have much to live off. Of course, it's been estimated on population and logistical calculations that the Imperial Japanese army at this point could total around 30,000 soldiers. So regionally wise, this was surely the force that Japan, under the banners of the emperor, could put together. But as we've seen, this imperial army also depended on the same nobiliar clans that controlled the imperial house. Nobody could levy forces hoping to stand in the field without nobiliar training, coordination, supervision, leadership, morale, coup d'oeil. So this is just some sort of wishful thinking. Japan's draft system, by the way, was in theory encompassing the entire country. There was, of course, a separation between the nobility and common farmers in practice. The imperial idea behind the reform was, however, in theory to make it just a unique body or something that should just cement, to put on the fore more than else, the Japanese imperial unity rather than, in fact, the feudal feuds that existed between the various clans. So there was no way to impose that standard of discipline and uniformity, which would have entailed complete cooperation of every nobiliar house, which was really not feasible. This led to an army, as a consequence, plagued by severe disorganization, stemming partly from the reluctance of the conscripted peasants that, again, did not really want to be soldiers, nor were essentially resources to make them so. So it was just a no-winner to begin with. You have just this militia that must be mobilized just to show some general commitment to the imperial political cause, also against the interests of the same lords that these peasants already worked for, that fundamentally were their protectors in some ways, and that allowed for some regrowth, right, of wealth, of stability in this dark era, so to say, and partly from the government's inability to create stable systems for advancement or leadership that could parallel, again, the nobiliar presence. How would you pay them exactly? The Buddhist monks maintained their own prerogatives, they had immunities and so on, so it wasn't simply like, okay, we'll co-opt another clan and we'll together, just alone, establish a new system of offices, like in China, that had a much longer sort of bureaucratic, administrative, statal history. Provincial governors found, of course, this setup highly advantageous. Imperial officials had little desire to fight wars themselves, but saw the soldiers under their command as a handy workforce for building palaces and tending estates. So that in practice, while some of this military reform was implemented, it was actually instrumentalized to exploit labor force rather than manpower, and entrenching further, actually, various clans in their respective lands, the privatization of the same public offices, and essentially the affirmation of a feudal reality further. In 724, the imperial army faced a humiliating defeat. In fact, that year, the Emishi, today recognized as the Ainu, rose up, killed the governor of Mutsu province, and took control of much of Japan's main island. This was a big deal, right? The Ainu / Emishi were indigenous people of northern Japan, essentially were the savages of the situation. We're talking also, they rebelled against the imperial encroachment into Mutsu, resisting forced assimilation, land seizures, and heavy taxation that was being, as we've seen, attempted just for the sake of further population exploitation. And so they killed the governor, they seized control in a fierce uprising, highlighting the deficiencies of the imperial Japanese military. At that point, the Fujiwara clan was called into cause because, as we've seen, they had monopolized the imperial court, and they rallied the conscripted troops contemplated by the reform, advancing into the defiant regions and setting up a base at Taga Castle. The Taga Castle was in the north of Matsu province, near modern Miyagi prefecture. The Fujiwara chose it as a strategic fortified base to launch operations against the Emishi, vital for its proximity to rebel territory and its defensive capabilities. Yet the rebellion endured, fueled by the insurgents' use of hit-and-run tactics. Because again, in Japan, basically the North is considered like they're just animals, right? They're just like, we said, like there is wilderness, there are, underdeveloped peoples. They're very interesting, by the way, even anthropologically throughout history. We will talk about that on some, because they have also more mixes with the sort of northeasternmost Asian mainland, also from an ethnic point of view. We also talked about medieval Korean warfare, if you're interested, and it's very beautiful, but we will come back on it for this reason as well. So, as one emperor described these events, the rebels, the Ainu, when attacked, flee like birds, when unmolested gather like ants. This is a typical tactic. Again, the North does not have much to offer for further expansionism, just this hopeful exploitation of the frontier. You do not venture into it so that these peoples can withdraw temporarily in those wild lands, and they will come back when you are just not watching. Basically, you're not strong enough to put up a resistance. At the same time, Japan's military regulations grew increasingly unwieldy. We don't even have to think of a veritable military reform being in place, like the Japanese military organization that we will see better in another video will remain basically the same. This was just, as we've seen, the last attempt to create a levy militia that would essentially be successfully framed under a hopefully more cohesive central government separated from nobiliar clans. In practice, all these regulations died out, simply like the system was exhausted. There was not much that could be done to change it. By 739, the imperial household admitted that sending conscripted troops into combat was tantamount to wasting their lives, which was correct because of what we just said. By the way, just yesterday we were talking about the Byzantine elite cavalry, and we were observing there how that enormous effort, we're more or less in the same years, brought eventually to the collapse in the first half of the century, accomplished the Islamic invasions, etc. So these are moments of exhaustion for everybody involved, without the possibility to establish a backbone of essentially peasant soldiers, in part subsidized by the state, in part just allowed to be out there without basically the interference of major landlords. You could not expect the conscripts to be a reliable military force. This is not to say, by the way, that the Japanese did not have good infantrymen of some sort, nor that some peasants had not maintained some kind of martial tradition, but it's the broader temper of the times. It's the increase, as we've seen, in nobiliar, private, oligarchic, magnate power that is eroding what was left of this possibility. You really need professionals, mostly elite troops, provided by the nobiliar retinues. At some point, even coming from outside of Japan, as we will see now, but at large, however, being an internal product, so to say. Besides, the army system, as it had been conceived in these early centuries, also imposed extreme difficulties on the people themselves. Drafted men had no option but to take their wives and children with them, because the latter had basically no other way to sustain themselves without their respective husbands and fathers, who would have had to support them on the paltry rations given to soldiers on top of this. It was actually a very brutal system to begin with, Japan was very autocratic and sort of very harsh in many ways. These families often emerged from service impoverished, and upon a soldier's release, his children frequently perished from hunger on the trek back home. This was all to the advantage of the nobility that was immensely profiting from this, essentially taking over the lands of all these people as they abandoned it for the military service. In any case, witnessing the further impoverishment of the peasantry and, again, the affirmation of their own magnate forces. In 780, the Emishi rebels struck with force, overrunning even the Taga castle and torching the army's entire supplies in the process. Right, so that after decades of exploitation, conscription burdens, cultural suppression, these rebels managed to sack the symbol of power, to disrupt imperial control. All the products, all the collections that had been drawn from the squeezed peasantry were destroyed in the process, highlighting, by the way, how much the noblemen retained control on all these resources. So this was a total disaster because it makes like both the imperial attempts to compaction and the ones of the major clans that had tried to sponsor this, revealing, however, the trend of a broader establishment, also in private. After this lost, imperial court conceded the failure of its conscripted forces for good. As a result, Emperor Konin disbanded the national army as it had been conceived, with Japan's leadership limiting conscription to dire emergencies. This move widened the growing gap between peasants and the warrior samurai class, while dismantling the army as a unified entity, boosting the power of local lords. Of course, in line of principle, the militia levies could be summoned, but it wasn't much a matter of how much you could force, in fact, this conscript into war. It was about the quality of the same, their background, what they had been doing up to that point. And so, as we've seen, this brings the common people even more down, with instead the essentially knightly class acquiring more power. Japan didn't overhaul its military framework until 789. New rules required the inclusion of skilled fighters and men handpicked for their physical might and ability. Of course, all of this would have existed in some form before. It's not like all populations. We've seen that it was essentially a rota system that had to be ready for campaign. But in practice, this was simply bypassed by the events, regardless of the exploitations of the impositions of the establishment on the people. The initial campaign against the rebels ended in catastrophe when imperial leaders directed General Kozami to strike during the spring thaw. So they tried for something more professional, something more at least select in nature. And also this campaign ended in really disaster. The rebels, in fact, caught Kozami off guard, driving him back. In the clash, the imperial army lost what could seem like very few. By the way, we are in a time between history and myth almost. As few as 25 men to enemy attacks, because these newer imperial forces weren't that bad after all, but they were poorly led, and a sudden flood killed 1036 soldiers. It cost a lot. As we've seen, a broader regional army at full display would have counted 30,000 men. Losing just 1,000 is considerable, especially thinking this was a smaller force. The government then mustered another army, entrusting it to Saka-no-ye no Tamuramaro, a very interesting figure, a Chinese-descended adventurer. In 794, Saka methodically stamped out the Mutsu rebellion. Saka-no-ye no Tamuramaro was appointed by the imperial court. In 794, he crushed the Mutsu rebellion with a reformed army, essentially, of trained warriors using precise campaigns, fortified bases, and lessons from past failures like Kozami's flood loss to systematically dismantle the Emishi resistance. So fewer troops, but better trained, better led by what were essentially free companies, commanders now hired by the government. Control of military might now lay, in any case, with the samurai families, given that any other military force was out of the game, and these noblemen were the backbone of Japanese military force. Having this warband lifestyle and sort of spiritual training behind them. Two leading clans, each encompassing many warrior households, became the foundation of imperial protection over time. These were the clan Minamoto and the clan Taira. The Minamoto and Taira rose as samurai clans after the National Army's 780 collapse, providing military muscle to a weakened court. Their power grew through loyalty to rival factions and battlefield success, because there is a lot of warfare going on in the meanwhile all across Japan. And Minamoto estates laid in eastern Japan, like Sagami and Kanto, while Taira lands spanned the inland sea, including Aki and Ise. While serving the emperor, the Minamoto and the Taira grew into rivals, of course, and at the same time, the clan Fujiwara, which had by then gained complete mastery, as we've seen, over the imperial court and the broader nation, softened under the lavish lifestyle and complex political games of the capital, which brought to its demise. This setup, of course, planted the roots of widespread calamity across Japan that got its initial glimpse of the danger in 930, when the Fujiwara employed their typical strategy of installing a young child as emperor. So maintaining the sovereign weak and wielding power by themselves, they picked 8-year-old Shujaku, born to one of the previous emperor's Fujiwara wives, as usual. As expected, a Fujiwara aristocrat took on the regent's role as well, and the clan chose a nobleman called Taira, a man that was actually like representing the F8 state that the Fujiwara were sort of criticized for stereotypically. So again, here it's history/myth, so this character played a bit the game, but apparently in the story, Taira was notorious for his effeminate and immature behavior. Historians record, for example, that one of his odd habits was carrying a fan decorated with a peacock and mimicking the bird's call each time he fanned it open, which it's sort of weird. Gives you the idea of this sort of properly alienated and emasculated figure that didn't know how to handle power properly. And around this power, Taira Masakado, the most renowned warrior in Japan, aimed to secure the governorship of his own province. Taira Masakado earned such fame in the first half of the 10th century for his unmatched combat skills, bold leadership in family feuds, and daring defiance of imperial authority, which, as we will see now, culminated in his rebellion that challenged the Fujiwara-dominated court with military brilliance. In fact, Taira handed the post to one of his indulgent cronies, Sadabumi, instead of Taira, that would have been sort of the most fit for the role. Obviously, Taira did not take this too well, but instead of rebelling, he couldn't stomach this. He just went back, however, just to his native land, frustrated enough by the situation. After all, again, he had something to live for. Nevertheless, on the longer run, this brought to a change, because Taira didn't spark an immediate uprising, but threw himself into fierce family disputes, right, to mess around a bit, so to expand his power in other ways. His brutal attacks on opposing samurais soon pushed him beyond the reach of imperial law, which was a way to essentially provoke the latter as well, leaving the imperial court to declare him an outlaw and taking him out. This is interesting because it shows how naturally different clans would, depending on their relation with the empire, still play against one another in such fashion. Now, rather than facing the humiliation of punishment from rulers, he loaded Taira Masakado at this point chose to rebel. He kicked off his insurgency by taking territory from the rival clan Minamoto specifically, and as we've seen had risen to significant power. He went on to seize 8 provinces and set up his own governing court there, showing that if he wanted, he not just could essentially fight back against imperial authority, but even rule beyond that divine recognition, which was again a pretty strong assertion of this nobiliar confidence in traditionally bestowed divine power, right? Masakado began by, as we've seen, raiding the Minamoto lands with swift targeted strikes, exploiting clan rivalries in there too. He seized 8 provinces using mostly guerrilla tactics, rallied local warriors with his charisma and leveraged his battle-hardened forces to eventually establish a rival court when enough power had been concentrated, defying imperial power up to 940. The Fujiwara leaders lacked the strength at this point to crush this breakaway movement. Masakado might have carved out his own state, but a social misstep intervened. In fact, while hosting the powerful daimyo, that is a nobleman, as you know, Taira Thoda, Masakado neglected to tie back his hair, which was a common practice of respect. In fact, Taira took this as a personal insult to his status as well, because again, this Masakado was a nobleman in his own regard, but there were also, higher, say, social strata within the various estates. And so this hierarchy was pretty much cared about by everybody involved. And to settle the score, Taira Thoda attacked Masakado's territory, succeeding in decapitating the rebellious as legendary samurai and delivering the head to the emperor as a proof that, after all, the establishment could finish off the disobedient. But Masakado was not just the soul of the revolt per se. The uprisings that he had triggered were caused by this major discontent towards imperial authority and government, and other lords would be soon eclipsed by a greater political turmoil. I'm skipping here lots of things in the process. We're passing from the 10th to 11th century. We arrive to 1141, when Emperor Taiken-mon-in began to suspect his first wife had given birth to an illegitimate child. As a result, he bypassed Sutoku, that was the presumed heir, and named Konoe, a son by another wife, deemed, of course, faithful at this point, we never know, as the next in line. This posed lots of problems because, of course, the imperial Japanese succession was a pretty serious thing, yet it entailed all divine law, which was enough to cause internal strife. Taiken-mon-in then stepped down to become a Buddhist monk, placing 3-year-old Konoe on the throne. A Fujiwara named Tadamachi stepped in as regent. Again, the Fujiwara were continuing, after all, to detain power, regardless of their problems and how the historiography represents them. Tadamachi and his younger sibling Yoringa despised each other intensely. This was an issue that shows you how, by the way, the imperial authority was subordinated to disputes within, like normally, like here, siblings of the regent's side rather than the issues of their own family. Now, Japanese scholars trace the rift of these two brothers to a clash over intellectual pursuits, which shows you how, again, advanced, sophisticated the Fujiwara clan was in that position. Tadamachi is shown in poetry and calligraphy, apparently, that had a very specific symbolical and religious meaning, while Yoringa, an adept manager, right, an economist, we could say, scorned his brother's skills as trivial decorations, showing that, there was more than that these older days were over, that had to be sort of more vigorous power being built. Because, by the way, we're in the 12th century, so economy has been rebooting from a while. There is more room for sort of military development as well. Now, when graver disputes flared up in imperial court, the brothers let their personal feud turn violent, obviously enough supported by their respective factions. Emperor Konoe passed away at 17. Sutoku then insisted the throne pass to his son, but Konoe's mother charged Sutoku with using magic to kill the emperor, a claim that the cultural regent Tadamachi supported. Yoringa jumped at the chance to defy his brother and backed Sutoku. The opposing court factions called upon Japan's warrior clans to reinforce their positions. Neither dominant clan took a solid side, in part because we will see this better in other videos, but Japan was particularly fragmented. Yes, there were some more hegemonic clans, but in part that depended on the proximity to the capital. Their individual capacity obviously would not allow them to simply take over the entire system or even just the majority of it. So it was somehow easy to spur this unrest, right? Taira and Minamoto samurai ended up fighting for both causes, telling how internecine this fighting really was. The civil war wrapped up quickly when Yoringa, despite his practical mindset, made the fatal mistake of trying to defend the wooden fortifications of the Shirakawa Palace. Yoringa chose the Shirakawa Palace in 1156, hoping that these stockades near Kyoto would hold defensively. This was an important fortress, a vital imperial residence symbolizing court authority. There was behind, as we've seen, Yoringa, this economic pragmatism over military sense. And so he preferred almost like the material rock, right, over the more moral, like ethereal conception. Maybe poetry and calligraphy would have support to an extent. Never underestimate the role of humanities in the formation of the nobility up to, last generations. We're not talking the third estate. Minamoto Tametono's warning went unheeded, and Tamadachi's forces burned this wooden stockade, as we'll see, practically ending the war. The Minamoto Tametono, by the way, we mentioned, is the brash, over 2 meters tall warrior, right, that warned Yoringa against his plan. So what happened here is that the minister ignores him. Tadamachi's troops under two commanders, Minamoto Yoshitomo and Taira Kiyomori, torched Yoringa's position. These two commanders mastered samurai warfare, archery, swordsmanship, and horseback riding, trained from youth in clan skirmishes and court conflicts. Yoshitomo excelled in direct combat leadership, while Kiyomori blended martial skill with strategical political maneuvering. The victors forced the defeated to execute their own kin as punishment for joining the fray to begin with. That's how cruel this Japanese political game really is. A Fujiwara called Shinzei managed the division of the spoils instead. The Fujiwara come back in a way or another, regardless of their own same internecine strife. Shinzei barely acknowledged Minamoto Yoshitomo. To add injury to insult, he denied even his own bid to wed his daughter, handing her instead to Taira chieftain Kiyomori. The Minamoto held on to this grievance. In 1159, internal Fujiwara rivalries ignited yet another crisis. This time, this would be basically about the imperial succession itself. Emperor Go Shirakawa, in fact, stepped down for his son Morihito, later called Nijo, but he still was the shadow looming over its political decisions and the fact of directing them. Fujiwara Shinsei stood by the ex-emperor. However, he faced foes within his own clan, namely the Fujiwara Tsunemune and Korekata, who joined forces with another key Fujiwara Nobuyori. And remembering Shinsei's slight to Minamoto, Yoshitomo, as we just mentioned, they recruited his family to their side. Yoshitomo knew that Taira Kiyomori would stay against them, so that when Kiyomori was away in Kumano, that is in the Kii Peninsula, southern Honshu, a rugged coastal region famed for its Shinto shrines and pilgrimage routes where Taira Kiyomori was visiting in 1159 when Minamoto plotted against him. See here also the tension between Buddhism and Shintoism. The latter planned to send a squad to strike him as he returned to command his forces. Despite the plan's urgency, Fujiwara Nobuyori botched it, letting Kiyomori rejoin his army unharmed instead. Right, and with the Taira forces gathered, the two clans met in a full-scale combat. This battle is quite famous. It's the Heiji Rebellion. Kiyomori rallies his forces in Kyoto against Minamoto, Yoshitomo, and Fujiwara Nobuyori. The Taira, with Shinsei support, used superior numbers and urban tactics, striking key points like Rokuwara, overwhelming the Minamoto in a swift, decisive clash that left the city scarred and Taira dominant. This was a very important triumph, a stunning one for Taira, and Shinsei could really boast it now. As a consequence, there is this epoch-changing event, that is to say, the fall of the Fujiwara. They stopped ruling through their own might. Taira Kiyomori, whose battlefield skill had twice defined Japan's future, seized this opening. The Taira leader foiled multiple assassination attempts. He maneuvered to become Zanji, or Counselor of State, a title once reserved for the Fujiwara alone. So in time, Kiyomori arranged for the emperor to live on Taira lands. Other important move. This is more or less the landscape that we are witnessing here. We will restart with the sort of high later Middle Ages in the following chapter, but you immediately understand how relevant these passages are in order to understand also the military side of the story, which again is not the strict focus of this miniseries, but it's just something we sort of discuss to be in touch with these Nipponic vibes for a more thorough, in-depth military historical analysis that surely is not going to be that far away. And we will look at much more, in fact, strictly, defined campaigns, battles as well. Likely we will talk a lot about the Kamakura period, by the way, because it's also the moment which you have the biggest, the threat from the Mongols under Kublai Khan and beyond, right? And again, if you look at the fundamentals of Japanese politics, you can immediately understand what we're looking at. There was actually a striking similarity between feudal Japan, in many ways, our European West, right? For this reason, there was say, not much of another standing army under probably the feudal one. And the daimyos that we have looked at were essentially paid to maintain some forces with the shogun or dictator that was behind essentially imperial power. And the samurai warriors were exactly these retinues, rather feudal lords, reflecting such knightly dimension of Japanese warfare in its own regard, right? So there was all a chivalric equestrian culture. We will see how a broader modernization of the system would not occur until the early 16th century. We will see that. So again, there are some interesting parallelisms that we can draw. And again, here we should also consider the presence of levies, the majority of Japanese say soldiers, numerically speaking. So those weren't properly even soldiers, as we've seen, but at least most of the cases. So these militias never leave. They're always part of the complement of this knightly elite that followed the samurais, the shogun. We will see them specifically because they themselves, again, there was some further certification here we should at some point look at better. But in general, right, there isn't even too much to say about the fundamentals of this Japanese warfare in medieval time, because once you get that, it's basically more or less similar throughout the years. Like, we can split hair for European warfare also because we know more about that, but even in that, you know that the fundamentals were not that different, were not that distant, and this helps, of course, explaining Japanese warfare as well, and that's something that I hope we're going to do more consistently over time. For the rest, you see how Schwerpunkt is simply opening to different stuff gradually. Like, if you, as you do, it's not that I need to demand it, but if you notice, like, with time, right, once I get the time, I do things, right, I do them, and so everything starts basically piling up, structuring, becoming all more hierarchically, corporately interconnected, and so we can pass from one part of another to it. Very well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time. See you next time. Bye.